Sit down. If you're going to stay, sit down. Come on. Okay. Yeah, it's our old friend documentation. So today, I didn't really get started till late. I had a lot of stuff to do, other than this. However, I've added some documentation to the base virtual machine. And the way I've done that is I've added Sphinx to generate the documentation. And I've started developing a framework for how to document these virtual machines and their setups. So this is all stuff to do with the outside development of the virtual machines and their okay, the way this works is you start with a virtual machine and then you put into that a configuration which then gets asserted inside the virtual machine to create the project. Once you're in the virtual machine, you're in the project environment, and that's a completely different kettle of fish. Okay, that's it will probably follow a similar pattern to this, but it's a different beast. So outside the virtual machine on the host, the idea is that you have installed Python and Poetry and VirtualBox and Vagrant. You clone the repository. Now, if you want to then read the full documentation, you use Poetry to install and then enter into a virtual environment. And what that does is that installs things like pre-commit and committizen, which are needed for the proper management of this system. Then you can go into the docs and do make HTML, and then you've got the full documentation available then under the build directory. So the full documentation will describe how the virtual machine is constructed and configured. It'll also document the procedures for doing development. So if you wanted to do development and follow the same procedures that I'm going to, then you would, you'd read the documentation, which would say things like, you should use committizen to standardize your commit messages. Pre-commit's going to check them for that standardization anyway, so you may as well use it. The pre-commit setup makes sure that certain checks are done, like, for example, linting all of the YAML files, making sure that white spaces and indentation are correct and all that kind of stuff. So, but that's all. This is all to do with the construction of the virtual machine. I'm also I'm going to create a packer as well, just to demonstrate how this works. That the packer file can effectively take the same configuration as is used in Vagrant to create a base box. So you end up effectively eating yourself, as it were, because eventually these development VMs will use the base box which they themselves generate. That makes sense. You'll see. It just saves a lot of time with the generation with the virtual machine setup. I should be clearer, actually. No, the base developer VM will create a base box for projects. So rather than the projects having to run the whole configuration in again, they can sort of skip over the basic configuration from the developer VM, and they can jump straight to asserting just the project specific stuff. But we'll get to that. At the moment, everything runs from scratch, just to make sure that everything's working as it should do. So there's that. So yeah, started to write documentation. It's brief at the moment, but it will do the job. The point being that we start with documentation straight away. I mean, I suppose really I should have written some tests first, but to be perfectly honest, the configuration so far is so trivial in terms of what goes onto the machine. I suppose I could do some smoke testing just to make sure that everything's set up and working the way it should do. So maybe I'll do that. Again, just as an exercise, really, there's not a huge amount to go wrong at the moment. But the documentation covers things like, you know, how to start up the virtual machine in the first place, how the configuration all works, how to do development work on the configuration, how to derive a project virtual machine from it, how to put your own personal configuration in. So the idea, the way the system's set up is it's effectively layered. So you've got the base virtual machine, which provides all the basic configuration facilities. Then you've got the project specific, which does things like if it's a Python project, it will install all of the Python tools and make sure that that's all set up. If it's a Lua project, then it will set up all the Lua stuff. If your project requires Python, Lua, Bash, blah, 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 you can put them all in together. Okay, so that's all explained. On top of the project, though, you've also got what I called personal configuration. Now, your personal configuration does things like, in my case, for example, it installs my preferred dot file setup. It installs NeoVim from source and it installs my NeoVim configuration so that everything works the way I want it to. Install Tmux and all these other tools that I like to use during my development on these machines. That's the project inside the VM. Finally, there is also a section on providing secrets, although at the moment the only secrets that are actually provided are the SSH keys, which get transferred into the VM so that they can be used for accessing the project Git repositories, things like GitLab and GitHub and so on, anything that requires an SSH key. So that's where we're at the moment. The documentation still needs a lot of work, but the framework's there, and I'm trying as much as possible to make it so that the documentation from the base virtual machine covers most of the setup, and then you'll be able to provide a project VM can then layer on top of that. The trick is to make it so that the documentation works in such a way that you minimize the conflicts. So, you know, if I add files for a project specific configuration, I want to make sure that when I do a pull from the upstream developer VM, any documentation that comes down is not going to interfere with it. I mean, I've done that with the configuration by separating out the base configuration from the project configuration. So that way the project is effectively completely independent. So there should never be a problem with pulling from the upstream. Documentation, on the other hand, there are certain touch points which it's difficult to avoid. But wherever possible, I'm making it so that it minimizes the risk of conflicts or problems with the pull. So yeah, so it's just trying to think ahead a bit. Yeah, it's a bit. It's starting to get a little bit more complicated, but the thing is, it's making things slightly more complicated now, but it makes the setup and use of the system somewhat easier. downstream. So people coming along, it's a very simple set of instructions to effectively achieve quite complex results. That's what we're about. So yeah, another day goes by, and all the Gitea stuff has been pushed down the road. This is mainly because I'm just too damn lazy to actually do the work. But in this particular instance today, I was busy in the morning. I'll be busy again part of tomorrow morning. Yeah, probably not going to get a huge amount done tomorrow either. We'll see if the mood takes me. It's starting to get interesting, so yeah. Yes, we'll do more. Anyway, yeah, not much to say really. I really ought to try and do a show and tell, I suppose. It's certainly getting to the point where a show and tell is feasible, and would make sense. I wonder if it's worth doing a show and tell just on the dev VM. Yeah, I'll do that. Maybe I'll do that tomorrow evening.